Without further ado, let me introduce to you our first speaker, Dr. Satyendra Gupta, whose JLO VirtYS advisor has been Professor Almas Heshmati. Satyendra is an assistant professor at the Jindal Global University in India, School of Government and Public Policy, and he will present to you his JLO VirtYS project on irrigation and culture, exploring the gender roles and women rights dimension of this question. Please, the screen is yours, Satyendra.
Thank you. Well, this is a joint work with PER, and let me just move this. Sorry. Okay. So my mic is not working. Okay. So, well, the motivation behind this project is based on some of the historical the papers that use the history or experience from the past, where where the researchers have tried to explain how some of the events in the history can explain contemporary social or economic outcomes. Some of the outcomes that has been identified or are important are like trust, gender roles, culture, or income level. So, and out in this literature, there is one particular field that looks at, sorry, just this, I'm just minimizing the photos, it's coming on my slide, okay, sorry. So out of, in this field, there is a subfield that looks at the experience of agriculture and some natural endowment and how it can explain our contemporary outcomes, for example, either conflict or individualism or female labor force participation. Then there is some literature that looks at the resource curves and where people have used resource like mines, diamonds, oil and gas, and irrigation to some extent. And in this paper, basically, we will be using irrigation. Okay. Okay. This looking at the gender roles is important because this gender inequality can affect the female rights, income, and welfare of the current generation, and also it can affect the children's education and their welfare as well. So if there is some inequality in the current generation, it can be passed on to the next generation and it can persist in the society. So it becomes important to understand why and how this gender inequality comes into the social, becomes a part of culture, and people use it or perpetuate it. Then another variable that has been used in the literature is Neolithic revolution, that's related to again agriculture or the use of plow. So these are few of the variables that have been used in the past. In this study, as I said earlier, we are looking at how irrigation can explain the gender roles in society. Why we are looking at irrigation? Well, if you look at on the left-hand diagram with the colors, it shows that irrigation is used across the world, and this is a diagram from the recent past. And if you look at on the right-hand side picture, then it shows how whether or not the irrigation was used in the societies in the past. And if you look at the red dots, that basically indicate whether a society was using irrigation or not, then we can find that the irrigation was used across the world. Well, sorry. Then there are a few observations that I would like to highlight about irrigation. Then the irrigation is something that pushes towards the muscle power in a society because of few reasons, like irrigation is an infrastructure that needs to be protected from your neighbors and the upstream farmers. And once people are using irrigation in agriculture, the agriculture becomes more intensive and there are more storable output that people would like to protect from the neighbors or people who could attack and would like to take it away. So it basically necessitates that there is muscle power in society. Then also it creates a division of labor, because traditionally what has been uh, found in literature is that generally males, they capture the technology and they enjoy the benefit of increase of productivity because of any kind of technology. Then also at the same time, the females are pushed into the activities that are close to the home or at home in particular. Then this can also create private property rights. And if what happens with irrigation is also that it creates a culture of elites or autocracy, and that basically uh, creates the insecure property rights. Or it has been also found recently that it can also create a culture of collectivism, where because in agriculture people are working together, and it can create a culture of collectivism in the society. And that it has also been found that the collectivism is associated with the traditional gender roles, and traditional gender roles have been not in favor of equality. So using all this uh, the literature, we have hypothesized in this paper that irrigation can yield gender bias, and that affects the labor market outcome and gender attitude in particular. The independent variable in this study that has been used is the irrigation potential that we have taken from a paper by Janet Mention, uh, and it has been developed using FAO data. And I will just highlight few things. If you, what happens, what this variables basically tells is, when if you can use irrigation in a particular area, then how much the productivity of agriculture will increase using the irrigation that particular area. So that increase that you can also see with the it shows here the class impact class 1, there's a 0% increase, that's with the green. And if you look at the red, that's the impact class 5, where the increase in productivity can be more than 100% if irrigation is used. Then we have used multiple data set to test our hypothesis. One of the data set that we have used in this study is the standard cross-cultural sample and also the ethnographic atlas. Well, the SCCS data is a subset of ethnographic atlas with more variables, so we can control a large number of variables, but the number of societies are less. So using this data that gives us the latitude and longitude of these societies, and we draw a circle of 200 kilometers around these societies to find the irrigation potential and other geographical control. Then our empirical specification is simple, where we use the, sorry, well, probably there's some noise coming in. Okay, so using this specification, our result shows that irrigation potential is indeed has a negative influence on female participation in overall agriculture. That's column 1 to 4 here. We have also control for like a major crop, whether a prehistoric group was using a cereal crop or whether there was class stratification in the society. Well, we use the cereal in particular because it has been argued in literature that though cereal is good for storage, but at the same time it needs for before eating it needs to be processed, and it takes more time for cooking as well. And generally this responsibility lies with the female at the household. So we control for this variable as well. And the last column basically shows that female time and effort on subsistence activities, and all these regression shows a strong association between the irrigation potential and the female uh, roles, whether it's in agriculture or with other subsistence activities. Then we looked at the Afrobarometer sample this is a sample of 34 African countries where, and from this data set, we can also identify what was the ethnicity of the individuals who have been surveyed, because in this data set, they ask the ethnicity of the individuals. So, and we use these two sample questions. One is when jobs are scarce, men should have more rights to a job than women. Basically, that's indicate a kind of social bias in the society, or not, or with the individuals, that they think that men should have more rights to job. And the second question from in the column 5 to 8, it asks for women should have the same rights as men to own and inherit land. Basically, it's about the property rights. And when we regress this with the irrigation potential, and in this case, the irrigation potential is for those for the ethnic group where they were living historically. So as we can again see in the first 4 columns, the relationship is positive and significant. That's basically indicate that individuals who come from society where the irrigation potential is high, they think that men should have more right for the jobs. And the column 5 to 8 indicate basically that women have these individuals thinks that women should have lesser property rights. And we have control for region and ethnicity for standard error. So those things we have done, and they are written in the paper as well. And I don't know how much time I have. I think I still have another 5 minutes, so I can discuss things in detail. Okay, so then we looked at the cross-country sample as well. So I will basically just quickly just move forward. Okay, so this, then one of the method that is basically used in literature is when we're looking at particularly culture, is we look at the immigrants, because when immigrants move from one society or one country to another country, they leave behind the institutions. And when they're living in another country, they face the institutions of the country where they have immigrated. And the only thing they take with them is their culture. So it isolates the impact of culture from institution. So we look at the immigrants, the children of immigrants in USA, and in our paper we have also looked at the immigrants into Europe. But this one is important to highlight here, because using this American Community Survey, we could identify the individuals who moved to US when they were young, basically they were under the age of 6. And we call this 1.5 generation immigrant, and we are using the female immigrants because they are not the first generation who moved to, let's say in this case, US when they are already adult, or the second generation who are born in US. So these are the immigrants who were born outside USA, but they immigrated to USA when they were basically they were kids. So using this sample, sorry, I will put the table here. So we found the similar results, that the people who have immigrated from the countries where the irrigation potential is high, this so that the females from those communities are working less in US as well, after controlling for all state effect and the country effect and all those things. And we have looked at a sample from India as well, where this is basically a DHS survey, and our results are still the same, that whichever sample we have used, that irrigation potential is negatively associated with the paid work or work outside the family. Then we have identified multiple mechanisms in this paper. One of them is warfare. The idea, as I discussed earlier at the beginning, that the idea, as I discussed earlier, when you have any kind of infrastructure, then you need to protect it. And it can create a culture of war, where the people are protecting their this irrigation infrastructure or their storage at home, or they need to fight to get the irrigation for their field, because the people who are, or the farmers who are upstream, they might block the water coming to their field, and it can eventually create a culture of warfare in a society. And generally male gets more advantage when we are talking of war. Then, as we discussed earlier, okay, so as we discussed earlier, that once the irrigation happens, females are forced to work at home, and so it creates also a division of labor. Then the they can be, as I was discussing again earlier, when we have the higher irrigation, then the political system in those society can be autocratic, and generally autocratic societies don't respect or promote the property rights. And when the property rights are vulnerable, then the female will get affected more. And it can, we also look at the culture of individualism versus the collectivism in the society. So we looked at these okay, these mechanisms, and as we can see that, for example, in column 1, it shows that with the irrigation potential, we have more external warfare. So this is a sample from the SECS, and similar things have been repeated in column number 4 to 6. When you look at the column number 4, and this is a sample for India, where we have looked at a war that has happened in last almost 100 years, and we looked at the total number of wars that has happened around a district, and then so the result shows that where we had a higher irrigation potential, we have more external warfare, and that can, our result shows that it can explain to a part of why we see this gender inequality. Okay, and then the further results that I discussed for autocracy or for individualism and property rights. So it gives the similar expected results what we have discussed. And this is what basically we have tested this hypothesis that female non-domestic labor force participation in female property rights are negatively associated with ancestral irrigation agriculture. And we provide evidence from pre-industrial societies and various other data sets. And we propose various plausible mechanisms for effect of irrigation on female labor force participation and female property rights in this paper. So with this, I will stop. And so I'm happy to take questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Satyendra. Perhaps if you can exit the screen sharing, then we can have everyone here in the discussion in a more joined up form. So there have been 2 comments and questions. Junhyun Kim, would you like to, I'm trying to find, would you like to ask your question, please?
Sure, thank you. Hi, Satyendra. Well, thanks for tonight's very interesting talk. This is Junhyun Kim, you can call me Jun. Yes, so I was wondering, the story's plausible mechanism is interesting, but it could have been that the already gender unequal communities who developed the gender inequality perhaps through some other mechanism, decided to settle in those lands, or maybe they had stronger army and defeated whoever was already there, and that created this historical pattern. So can you rule out or account for that possibility?
Okay, so, well, explicitly we have not tested this because one of the problem is that we don't have the gender inequality data from past. So we can't explicitly test this whether the gender inequality was already existent in the former societies or not. That is one limitation. But though we haven't tested it, but we can argue that the most of the prehistoric societies, basically they started with the hunter-gathering, and there are evidence that they were probably less unequal. So that's something we can look at, but we haven't explicitly tested this thing. Yes, that's a limitation at the moment.
Would you like to get into that discussion?
I mean, it's just you know, it's the same thing that that was mentioned by John, because the issue, it seems like the paper is making this argument that this irrigation is the main thing, without really kind of justifying that there is no, because there's a possibility that, like was mentioned before, there might have been other things. So there might be a omitted variable bias here, or in terms of controlling for reverse causality, and the argument seems to be that this is the only thing that determines the gender inequality, which is a strong argument to make if you can't test for other things.
Well, though I didn't see most of the many results that we have in our paper, but what we have done is we have control for many other things. For example, in our particularly in the cross-section, cross-country results, for example, we have control for the plow use. We have looked for the Neolithic revolution, when it happened, the number of years. So we have control for many other things in our robustness checks that have been proposed in the earlier literature, that they can create gender inequality. So though I couldn't show all those results, but yes, we have done various robustness checks for other things that are generally being argued can create the gender inequality.
I wonder though, because your measure, it's not a measure of irrigation. Your measure is a measure of potential for irrigation. So yes. Actually, like, I don't know, I'm just thinking about June's question, that it's not that more unequal, gender unequal communities settled in well-irrigated lands. If kind of following this in your setup, it would be, if this was the case, they would have settled in actually less irrigated lands that would have benefited most from irrigation, right? So this is like I would see this measure as an instrument for irrigation, or something which is, I think it's worth considering, but.
Yes, well, we have also argued, because we understood this limitation of reverse causality as I think both of them have highlighted earlier as well. Basically, we discussed this thing in relation to the immigrants, particularly to the US, and our argument is that it is less likely that the people who, for example, if there is a society that is unequal and they have higher irrigation, then it is we have argued that it is unlikely that the people or the male from that society will be moving out of the country or immigrating. So that's from the cultural perspective. We have argued who will be the first to immigrate if there is a gender bias in the country and they have a culture of and that comes because of irrigation. So to some extent we have argued, but yes, still there can be a problem of selection bias, and yes, those are limitations at the moment.
Thank you. Other questions? Please, Almas.
Thank you. I read the paper, I think once or twice, and I wrote detailed comments for Satyendra. I am not sure how much of it is reflected in the current version that he presented it, but I found the paper very interesting. There is a number of factors other than irrigation that could be decisive for this gender role. For instance, irrigation, because it leads to higher productivity and a different division of labor. But we have also technology and education that in even a stronger way leads to differences in productivity of labor, and they're not causing any kind of gender inequality in role. Because if you look at developed countries, that they have higher education, high technology, so still women has much stronger role than before. So that's why probably is a unique situation that we think irrigation, you can isolate the effects and it can lead to, has implication for gender role and also property right. It would be interesting to look at, for instance, societies that they have irrigation, but irrigation is mixed with technology and education, like dropping irrigation. They use it in countries like Israel and in societies that are like rural societies. That could be interesting to see what is the role of women in those societies with strong technology, strong education, and irrigation plays a very important role in agriculture. Otherwise, the best factor that led to reduce this gap is basically war. That's what happened in Europe, that women become liberated after the Second World War, and this First and Second World War. They got into the job market and become, they changed their role. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yes, we have worked on various of your comments in the latest draft. But still, few of them are still left, and we are trying to find some ways to incorporate them. So yeah, we are working on your comments. Thanks.
Thank you. Very interesting paper. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that thank you very much, Satyendra, for the